firm that invests in really early stage startups. So we are on a mission to discover and fund and train and support world's best future unicorns that have to knock together to Silicon Valley. And this is not a dig against the Silicon Valley, just a belief that talented people will exist in different geographies, and the knowledge is not evenly distributed, and the network is not evenly distributed. And so you could pick up a great alpha and create a lot of goodness and pick up overlooked founders, be geographically, demographically, or ethnographically if you open your network, and that's what we do. So for those of you familiar with the sector, we're inspired by what Y Combinator did in their early years, but we are bringing in deliberately to the places that have been overlooked. And that's me, 68 investments that we're doing this is 2018, driving to nice 40% IRR. And after I tell all of that, 70% of my founders have either women, minority, or someone who in a C position. I do it with leaders numbers. So that's me in a nutshell.
I promised power back, and we're just only getting started. Okay? Nneka, over to you.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone.
Good
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
My name is Nneka Ukpai. I am a recovering lawyer. I transitioned to startups in the pandemic. I am a two-time founder. I co-founded one of the most popular social labs in Brazil, at least according to Forbes. And I also co-founded an early stage fintech that's based in DC. I started investing about 9 years ago. Before I had the right words for what I was doing, my law school roommates and I were loaning our friends money when they had funding gaps, and they were returning that capital to us with returns of up to 20%. And so we started researching it and getting more intentional about that activity. And fast forward a few years, we have syndicated and deployed about $100 million into 300 startups. I also was the head of innovation at Better, one of the world's biggest fintechs by volume. We've done about $100 billion in volume globally. Because I'm uniquely divergent, I'm now the Chief Investment Officer at something called Pop Venture. It is a registered fund that is on a mission to democratize access to the private capital markets by essentially inviting all of the country to invest in the best startups we can find. So we're bringing venture capital to the kitchen table for the first time ever in America, and I'm very excited to share a little bit of what I've learned with you today. And I'm also very excited that my voice is still working after a night of 90s rock, and I am still halfway there living upon a prayer. It's great to be with you.
Thank you, Nneka. Sanjit, you want to go next?
Before I go, I want to give a round of applause to both the fantastic ladies here. There are very few women VCs to start with. To start with, because venture capital industry is unfortunately largely dominated by males, and it's an honor to share this panel with both of you. And thanks to Rakesh for putting together this panel. My name is Sanjit. I'm from Bay Area, been in Bay Area for 20 plus years. I co-run UFirst Capital, and that's a venture capital fund that I co-founded. Before that, I used to be at Intel Capital, and over the years at UFirst Capital, we have made over 25 investments, and largely we are investors in AI. Way before ChatGPT came, we were investing in just my disclaimer. In AI, in B2B software, in cybersecurity, and networking. So those are the areas that we largely invest in. Of late, we have invested in Anthropic, if you're familiar with that LLM company. Also Cohere AI, which is another LLM company. And there's a $10 million investment that we just closed. I can't talk about the company, but it is another company, famous company in the LLM space. So increasingly, I think our investments are going now up and down the stack. By stack, I mean the enterprise stack. Not just LLMs and applications, but also data prep and the new data architectures that have to come up. We invested in a stealth mode company that is creating the next gen data bricks for Gen AI adoption, for LLM adoption. By way of education, I have a PhD in chemical engineering, semiconductors. So that's my early background. I used to be in tech roles and then gravitated towards venture capital and so on.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. At this point in time, I do want to take a minute to set the context for our discussion here. So this topic of big tech and emerging tech, right, when it was given to us, and I started to think about it. On the side of big tech, when you kind of think about them, the natural names that pop into our psyche is the Microsofts of the world, the Googles of the world, the Metas of the world. And these are, believe it or not, they have been some of the most innovative names. They have been some of the most innovative companies on planet Earth. But then the other side of us tells and challenges that thinking, right? It says, have they grown too big to be innovative? Are they rightly poised to continue their innovation cycles they have, the way they have in the past? Think of the other side, the emerging tech companies, right? You think of them, you inherently assume that these are the uber cool companies who always, work on disruptive technologies and, they are out there to solve the, challenges of humanity. But then the other side of it, really makes you challenge that premise as well. How many of those have really scaled up to the point where they have achieved mass adoption, mass scale, right? So there are more questions to this particular topic than answers, and I thought, I would kind of hypothesize a few things, put it in front of the panel, and then kind of, pick their brains and take a few thoughts of what they think about it. The first thing that, I wanted to kind of validate with the panel here is, what are the dynamics of innovation, right, when it comes to big tech and emerging tech? Are they the same or are they really different? So now you meet with them,
So I explained to my son, which is right now 6'2", but when we were starting, he was like, shortly like, Mom, what do you do at work? And I said, well, I run kindergarten for future unicorns. And I think that proven to be very true because by the nature of where I have to live 10 years in the future with the people that are attempting to change the world. And the number one thing, but in my prior life, I used to be an McKinsey consultant. I understand how decisions are made in a big company. I've worked for Motorola at the time of the raise. I understand how difficult innovation could be when you have a rebellious idea, because I was part of the marketing team when we launched Razor and it was deeply unpopular. Yet that was, and all of our necks were on the line to back that product versus completely forgettable V73-52 that none of you guys remember right now. So there was a real disconnect. And the very first thing, if you're trying to bring innovation into company, the world I live in, the plane is on the takeoff. And you do a lot of things in a way that is dramatically different because your job is to discover whether there's something. It's inherently risky. You're doing it at super high speed. And you have yet nothing to lose but your time and your dreams. And so you're going bold because there is literally nothing to, you don't have an infrastructure yet. When you're cruising the plane over here, you have a lot to defend. And you have a big ship that you don't want to lose, so you do want to innovate, but there are a lot of other parts that you have to play. And those dynamics, they're not easy to reconcile. And I think in many ways, when I think about how does the emerging tech bridge the big tech, it's how do the humans that sit here, because it could be the very same human that could perform really well here and performing here, they will be performing to completely different metrics and they will be playing under very, very different rules. So that is a very philosophical and very important distinction that you need to understand, because if you understand that, all you guys could create systems and processes that would support company over here taking a bit of a risk over here. And that could be done, of course, by doing it internally, by buying, by doing other things. But the first rule of the game is to understand how different it is. That to me is like the mindset is paramount, and you go deeper if you want, but that's number one.
Yeah, I find it an interesting question because we all think about innovation in different ways. The word means something different to different people depending on where you sit. And when it comes to enterprises versus emerging companies, digital natives that are just coming up, I've worked with both. I've worked with companies large and small. I've advised lots of companies on their product roadmap. And when I think about innovation, I think about it in terms of arcs of growth. McKinsey stuff, right? That first arc being the core arc of growth. The things that are your bread and butter, how you make money day in and day out. What are you doing to optimize second arc being the things that are immediately value accretive to the first arc. So to put a finer point on it, for an example, at Better, my former company, we did digital lending in the mortgage space. So it made sense for us to innovate in insurance. It made sense for us to innovate in real estate. It made sense for us to innovate in all the areas that are adjacent to home ownership. And I think that enterprises do those two things very well. That third arc of growth, though, which is where I really like to play, is the big shots, the moon shots. The things that may or may not work out, but if they do, might literally be the future of the company. And so when we're talking about innovation, I think it's really important to set the table and define what it is that we're discussing, because a lot of times it can seem like a very nebulous and big topic, but innovation happens at all levels of every company. And I'm reminded of an example. Southwest Airlines actually had a mid-level engineering person who wrote a little bit of code that allowed people to pay a small amount of money to opt into early selection of different items, right? It was just a little bit of code, a little bit of time of investment, and it ended up being a multi-billion-dollar new revenue line for Southwest Airlines. That is innovation. And we live in a country that put a man on the moon before we put wheels on a suitcase. And so I think it's really important for us to think about innovation, not just as these massive ideas, but also as the little things that we can improve process-wise within our organizations. In terms of enterprises, and don't kill the messenger, I believe that there's a lot of bureaucracy. I think there's a lot of red tape. I think it's very difficult to get an idea from 0 to 1 because you have so many competing priorities and you only have a finite amount of resources unless you're able to get executive buy-in and convince people that they should be investing in this new idea. And so what ends up happening is you have a directive. Let's say the board is telling senior management, we want you to increase profit by 100% over the next 3 years. The product team has an idea of how to do it. The sales team has an idea of how to do it. The marketing team has an idea of how to do it. How do you vie for those resources? And typically within a large enterprise, the product roadmap is set. You have a set amount of product design and engineers working towards a specific goal. They have Q1, Q2 goals, H1, H2 goals, and it's very difficult to get their attention diverted to something new just because you have a new idea. And so what I find really fascinating about emerging companies is their nimbleness, their ability to move, their ability to execute, their bias for action. Because really, to Oksana's point, they have nothing to lose but time. So if a single human being has an idea and is willing and able to execute against that idea, I find it typically easier and faster to accelerate the innovation cycle. And I would love to see more big tech companies borrow that from emerging companies, even if it's within a small pod. I find that no one will ever say no to an experiment. And so I encourage my portfolio companies when they're trying to get executive buy-in to say things like, well, let's do an A/B test. Maybe I'm wrong. Let's experiment. Let's gather some real data and analyze what the impact could be. Very few people will ever say no to that. So I'm encouraging everyone to think more broadly about what innovation looks like and how big or small it can be.
Different dynamics clearly, and that's probably the reason why big companies try and set up smaller COEs to kind of augment ideas they want to experiment with. Sanjit, is your feeling the same?
Yeah, no, thank you for asking that great question. Innovation in large corporations is kind of stifled, unfortunately. There are a handful of companies. I'm very impressed by Meta and how they have created Llama 3 open source. Incredible. But I don't see too many such examples. Even Google is struggling to compete in the LLM market. They have all the money, they have all the resources, they have the best engineers, etc., still struggling. Why? And then Google is just one example. If you start looking at Fortune 100 corporations, you will see that a lot of them are getting stuck in innovation. And I think the fundamental reason for that is there are little kingdoms freedoms that the vice presidents and the executive vice presidents have created for themselves, and they are more focused on protecting their turf and growing that kingdom. Number one. Number two, they are accountable for driving the revenue. The metrics they are being measured on by Wall Street are okay. The financial metrics, growing, not growing, all of that. So they are more focused on tweaking the current product and eating more out of that rather than driving orthogonal innovation. And that's a challenge. The second point I want to mention is innovation is also a mindset. It's not just about putting together an intrapreneurship program within a complete startup program or a VP or an executive or a GM driving, hey, okay, let's start looking at different ideas. I think you need grounds up level mindset change in a large corporation. That's very hard because now we're talking about changing the DNA of the company. And that's obviously not going to happen overnight. You talked about bureaucracy, so I don't want to repeat that. That's another factor. And if you compare all of that to the startup world, 3-person startup in a garage, there's no bureaucracy, there's no approval process. They are excited about making an impact. You might think startups are excited about making money. No, I used to think that too when I entered the venture business. Having worked with several startups, they are more about, I want to make my mark in this world. I will show to everybody I'm right and the product will work more than the money. So that level of self-motivation is missing, largely missing in corporations. Now there are islands of cases where employees at a personal level will start driving things and they're self-motivated. That's fine. But at a corporation level, we don't see grounds of innovation. And especially the orthogonal innovation that is needed for big tech to compete. And that's why, if you look at the life cycle of a large corporation, there are some 100-plus-year-old corporations in the US that still exist but have kind of lost relevance. IBM is a good example. There are some corporations that have died. Blockbuster is a famous one. Netflix took over. There are others. There used to be a company called DEC. Nobody even knows about them anymore, right? And so on. And they died due to death by 1,000 cuts because they just couldn't innovate across the board. They could innovate in one part, but that was not enough. And I think bringing it home to where we are in the AI sector today, AI era today rather, I think we are going to see that same thing. My forecast is that the Fortune 10 are going to change in the next 10 years, driven by AI. You're going to see maybe some of the existing Fortune 10 will stay, but not all. You're going to see new entrants. It's same as, will AI take your job? To lesser extent. Your job will be taken by somebody who embraces AI faster than you. Similarly, for corporations, they will lose to other corporations or other startups who will embrace AI faster than you. And that's why I think the Fortune 10, Fortune 20 list is going to revamp.
Thanks a lot, Sanjit. I think that was a great sum up of the differences of the agenda of innovation across larger enterprises, the big tech companies, and some of the emerging tech companies. Now you're all investors, right? You have the feel for money, you have the feel for the economics of innovation. I do want to kind of touch a little bit on the economics of innovation. Why don't I actually start from you, Sanjit? Do you see that the economics of innovation for, let's say, the big tech companies and the emerging companies are different, or are they on the same level playing field?
This is where I feel money corrupts. When a GM kicks off a $100 million project, puts together a team of, 30 engineers and growing rapidly, and says, okay, we're going to create the next self-driving car, here is the roadmap, in 2 years we'll have beta and so on. Typically, we don't see those projects being very successful, and we see $100 million going down the drain. Because they have typically hired internal engineers They have hired internal business people. So all of that DNA is still the same. Whereas if you compare, and one of the startup CEOs taught me this, he said, when I raise VC funding, if I have raised $10 to $20 million, you should compare me to a project within a large corporation. How much funding does that project have? Sometimes it's at a similar scale. You can look at a big tech, they may have a balance sheet of $1 billion, but what are they funding at a project level? It's actually it's comparable to a well-funded VC startup. So funding is not the limitation, right? So in that scenario, then the startup wins more often than not because of the reasons we talked about. They have nothing to lose. They have everything to win. They are, as I said, they're trying to make a mark, they're trying to prove the product, and they also move fast. They fail fast. They pivot fast too. All startups, all successful startups go through a pivot, no matter who you are. Even if you are a Zuckerberg level CEO, you create a startup, you see the failures, you pivot. But they pivot faster than large corporations. The problem with large corporations is they've announced to the world, now there is ego involved, there's so much involved to say, oh no, this didn't work, let's kill it and let's start something new. You can't do that.
Right.
Yeah, the other problem with large corporations is that they have a lot of money. So they're not facing an existential crisis if they're not able to deliver or able to pivot. They're not facing an end of runway, go out of business type of situation. And so you have a lot of folks who are there and they're excited about the work and they're dedicated. It's not the same type of hustle as emerging tech companies that have a limited amount of funding and a limited amount of runway. And another really important thing that you touched on is this notion of failure. I think it's so important for big tech companies to be more thoughtful about what ROI they're attaching to innovation. Sometimes it fails. And if you don't encourage a culture of courage where people don't fear for the loss of their jobs if an innovation doesn't work, you're never going to have true innovation because people will continue to play it safe so that they can keep their jobs. And I just want to ask for a quick show of hands. Does anyone in here remember the fire phone? Of course you did. Okay, 3 people. And it was an epic failure, right? But Amazon's failure to launch a smartphone is the only reason why we have Alexa today. Without the failed fire phone, we would not have Alexa. And so when I'm talking to tech companies that are telling me they want to innovate, they want to accelerate innovation cycles, typically what they say to me, I ask them, how long does it usually take to bring a new feature or a new product to market? They're telling me 2 years, 3 years. I'm typically able to do it in 6 months, 9 months. I had one app go from my head to the App Store in 3 months. It's all about that bias for execution and the willingness to drive at the result. And I think that when you are at a scrappy startup that has, struggled to raise the funding that they do have, and they know that that funding is going to need to be replenished either by revenue or by additional funding that's going to need to be supported by proof points. It's just a different level of grind. And so I find that emerging tech companies, to Sanjit's point, pivot quickly because they recognize what's not working and they recognize if they continue on that path, they will run out of money and they will be a story of the past. And I don't care who you are, big or small, if you are not investing in figuring out how your business can be disrupted, you are bound for disruption. And so when I talk to these companies, I tell them it's do or die. It's differentiate or die. It's disrupt or die. The options are very clear. And so a lot of earlier companies are more willing to embrace that concept. The companies that are already making money, the big tech companies that are doing relatively well, don't embrace that message in the same way.
Oksana, I don't want to hand that question to you directly because I know that you have this management trick of messing with your portfolio company's minds.
Yeah.
You set them on the stage of 3, 3, 2, 2, right?
Yeah.
For them to to scale up, do you want to talk about how you link innovation with alloy?
Well, I think I'm gonna go like maybe just to go tie this question was discussed, because while we talked about, I agree with everything that Nneka and Sanjit have said, but we could learn from this, because power law is not new. There are great books written about this. And I think what I see corporations failing is organizing for, if you look at a typical corporation, how does you make, let's say, 10 bets. I bet if you're in big companies, you're expecting 80% of them to succeed. And if only 50% of them succeed, you likely someone's neck will be on the line. Which is, if you look at the typical portfolio company of an early stage VC, you're going to have a few people that will come for the failures of the rest of the portfolio, and that is expected. So you set up a funnel, you have a limited funding, and you have very clear milestones. When we coach startups, you have to go, you have this much money, you have to go from here to here to get the next funding, and then you're accountable for that. And as that funnel converges, you're going to expect some of them fail, but the people that will shoot forward are going to step forward and play massively. That is not how, like I've talked to a lot of chief innovation officers, that is not how most innovation centers are organized. So we know Silicon Valley, like where innovation happens outside of the Silicon Valley, we know how a good VC fund is organized, yet if we want to bring that level of innovation, it's actually quite easy to set up a similar structure. We just are not daring because the level of failure, to Nneka's point, will be too much, and then we're going to shower them with money, so people are going to be doing luxurious things, right? So now, strip all that away and put it in the startup that, my startups, the startup is $100,000, not a lot of money, but $100,000 in 3 months could take you really, really far if you're mega focused on this. So people come to us and they have a product and a customer, the customer better not be random. And then we're expecting them to go and think about this for a second, you all probably math inclined. Envision 10% week-over-week growth. Because when they're in our program, that is what we're asking of them. Imagine, think about any project, have any of the projects that grow week-over-week, like we barely manage in the corporate setting to, I don't know, like follow up with the meeting notes from the last meeting notes over a week. Like 10% week-over-week is ridiculous. Now, when they get to maybe like $1 million, they have to be, like there's a saying, we see triple, double. That is the expectation. So how many of the products that we are looking at are expected to triple their revenue for 3 years in a row? Because that's expectations once you get to maturity. And when those expectations are set, and they're combined with the fact that you're released from the shame of failure, that's when magic happens. But sometimes that is very difficult to reconcile with the quarterly reports, with the profit to the shareholders, with the board of directors, yet it's necessary. And you could put experiment, not all of the budget could go there, but I think if you set up a small portion of your innovation budget to actually shoot for the moon, I guarantee you, engineers and people that are just as good, those moonshots will happen. But you have to create that magic garden for them to succeed with that.
So, I want to pick up on that a little bit.
Yeah.
Is that the place where big tech and emerging tech really converge when it comes to innovation? Is that the small pocket of investment that you are advising? Even Sanjit spoke about it. Start small. It could potentially become a moonshot. So, is that one way of convergence, or are there many as well?
Well, I don't think that naturally converge right now. And I think if you truly want to converge, then there has to be a push, like a meeting the two minds from both sides. So how would you learn about some of the emerging technologies? Folks like us will connect them, or they will encourage them to like knock on your LinkedIn, or like cold call you, or kind of get introduced. And they're super motivated to get that revenue, to penetrate. I don't see an equal pool from the top, but if people truly want to be innovative, go to the startup conference, listen to a gazillion of pitchers, get friends with people, like join in the angel network, see those deals, see what's happening, because because there is a natural disruption here happening, and that is how your companies end up buying and paying nice multiple for the technologies you do need, versus if you knew of them earlier, you could have probably gotten there inside earlier. Good for people like us, really good for people like Sanjit, But I think that for the corporations, that overlap could be managed, should be managed, but it will include someone just to take a comfortable step and spend some time learning about what's going on.
What's your thought on the convergence?
Yeah, Oksana raises a number of very fascinating points. Whenever there is a conversation happening about what's next, what's on the horizon, there's always a buy versus build discussion that's going to happen internally. You're going to have to get alignment at the most senior level on whether it makes sense to either divert resources to build something new or invest in hiring more resources to build something new, or do we seek out a company that's already doing it? A really good example is that when I was at Better and I was the head of innovation there, we were thinking about low-emission homes. We were thinking about eco-friendly homes and how to do that. And we invested in a number of companies who were even competitors of each other who were tackling that problem. And our thought process was, one of these folks is going to figure it out, and then there'll be a very, very, very attractive candidate for M&A activity. And we did a lot of M&A activity even at the company, even though it was technically an emerging tech company. We were doing M&A activity with younger emerging tech companies who were building things that we just didn't have the time or resources to focus on. And I think that that is something that big tech companies could do a lot more of. I know that a lot of big tech companies have armies of engineers and believe that they can build anything. Like I said, I'm a recovering lawyer. I was a white-collar criminal defense lawyer. Folks violate NDAs at will. I used to be paid to make the argument of why the NDA is not applicable, so that does happen. But I think that if we're intentional about fostering more collaboration between the companies that are reaching enterprise status and the companies that are emerging, that are really creative, really disruptive, when they're able to work together, you get better outcomes for the clients. And I'm a fintech human, so I'm going to index a little bit on fintech here. We have about 80 neobanks in this country. And a lot of emerging banking platforms had a grand time disrupting bigger banks. But at the end of the day, if there aren't innovative financial technology products that are being offered, and you're offering the same products that they can get from a Bank of America or a Wells Fargo, and then you layer on SVB going into receivership last year, you end up with an ecosystem where people are like, do I really want to move all my money to a new platform? Or do I want to keep my money at one of these big 10, top 10 banks? But the top 10 banks can't service the startup business in the way that an SVB can. The big 10 banks can't service an immigrant that just came to America that has plenty of credit history in their country, maybe not here. They haven't figured out how to do that, but Brex has. So I would love to see more intentional collaboration among the legacy companies that have the trust and brand recognition of the consumers, collaborating, even in white label fashion, with the emerging tech companies that are being very thoughtful around how to meet the needs of these unique consumers.
Sanjit, thoughts on?
Yeah, I think some of the points have been mentioned, so I'll talk about different aspects. One area where big tech converges with emerging tech is distribution, market distribution. Because emerging tech, whether it is startups or whether it is new technologies like VR, etc., in large corporations, they all need distribution in the market and they don't have it. So they need help from the existing big tech for that mass adoption, and it doesn't always mean consumer adoption, so the business uses too. So that is one area of convergence. Second is when large corporations start realizing I have missed out on X, Y, and Z innovation in terms of sectors or in terms of certain expertise or team expertise, and then they start hunting for smaller companies, especially startups, for acquisition. So that's the second area. And that trigger point is FOMO driven, typically by the large corporations, fear of missing out. They're like, oh my God, what is happening here? I am trying to see if I can give the name, but anyway, yeah, maybe I can give the name. Cisco acquired a startup a few years ago, 4 5 years ago, and the trigger point was at the Cisco annual sales conference. They had a slide with competition, showing competition in orbits, and in the second orbit there was a startup that started showing up. The sales guys were telling Cisco management, hey, there is a startup that is eating our lunch, taking customers away. That triggered the acquisition process by Cisco, and the company was acquired for like $600 million. So that is another convergence point. Sales guys see what is happening in the market more than the engineers, sometimes more than the management also. So they become the entry point of, hey, there's something happening, I'm hearing from the customers. We don't have a product here. In that case, the startup had replaced Cisco at all, no, I shouldn't say all, but startup had begun the process of replacing Cisco at all the gap scores. And that's big for a company like Cisco. You start losing gap as a customer. Even if it would not have resulted in the loss of all the stores across the US, the fact that a startup was able to encroach into that was phenomenal.
And drives the point of convergence. Right?
Yeah.
I know we've probably run over by 7 minutes already, but probably 30 seconds of wrap up here. There are two things that I took away from this conversation. Right? I at least had two answers. The first one is that innovation happens everywhere. It's not bound within the walls of big tech companies or let's say the emerging tech companies. It happens just about everywhere. The second thing is that we probably have been unfair to these two parties in using that common yardstick to measure them for innovation. The yardstick has have to be different. It's not the same set of metrics that they have to be measured with. But however, having said that, I think there is this